This is episode 35 of Ethics and Culture Cast from the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Welcome to episode 35 of Ethics and Culture Cast from Notre Dame's DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture. I'm Ken Hellenius, the communications specialist at the center. In this episode, we sit down with Professor Ernest Morrell of the Center for Literacy Education and the Departments of English and Africana Studies. We talk about his journey to Notre Dame, his work forming future educators, and the necessity of developing a critical media literacy. Let's sit down for this week's wonderful conversation. Well, Professor Ernest Morrell, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, Ken.
So tell us a bit about yourself. Where are you from? Where did you do your studies? What did you do before you came to Notre Dame?
Well, I was born and raised in Northern California. I was born in Oakland, but mostly raised in San Jose. So I spent my entire first 40 years in California. I did my undergraduate work at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And then I was a high school teacher for a while in the Bay Area. And during that time, I went back to graduate school, and I got my MA and my PhD from Berkeley.
Okay.
So when I finished, as I was finishing, and it was the late 90s, we moved to Southern California, and I began working at UCLA while I was finishing my degree, and I got a job in an institute there. So I spent most of the next decade at UCLA, from being a graduate student to an associate professor. In 2009, 2010, I was approached by the provost at Columbia and asked if I wanted to direct an institute out there. So in 2010, I applied for that position, and so I spent 7 years as the director of an institute and a faculty member at Columbia prior to coming here. So most of the past 20 years, San Francisco, New York, and Los Angeles, and now South Bend.
Coast to coast, now to the center.
Yeah. So that's kind of how the first phases of my life went prior to coming to Notre Dame.
Awesome. Well, why did you and your family want to come to Notre Dame? What brought you here?
Well, I mean, it's it's an interesting question because it was during my tenure at Columbia where I had passed the last barrier review, we call them. I became a full professor and an endowed professor. I was a director of an institute. I was also president of our professional organization. And I began doing a lot of thinking about, what is it that I want to do with the rest of my career? Because I was relatively young to have, kind of leapt over all those bars. And, so I had a lot of career ahead of me. And I began thinking about, from a couple of ways. One, from the research I wanted to do, but two, just the quality of professorial life and what it's like to be a Catholic at an anti-Catholic university.
Mm-hmm.
We can call them a-religious, but that's just more innocuous than it really is. You learn, and I love my time in the Ivy League and the University of California system, but to be honest, they're anti-Catholic spaces. And there's some outright hostility, but then there's just also a real tempering of the energy that otherwise could evolve into really good work. There you connect the principles of Catholic social teaching and your scholarship. Yeah. And that became more and more of a desire. Part of it was a real specific desire to do work in Catholic schools. Mm-hmm. But more so was a more broader intellectual thrust that I should be able to bring my Catholic identity into my scholarship more robustly. I've proven that I can do peer review research and teach at a high level. So it was that desire that ultimately led me to reach out to Father Tim Scully, mm-hmm. who I saw as doing really innovative work that looked at vulnerable populations, looked at literacy and education, and looked at it through the lens of Catholic identity or Catholic schools. And we struck up a relationship. He invited me to do a talk, and then I became a visiting professor for a couple of years. And I thought, this will be a nice partnership. Sure. At that point, my family was settled in Long Island, and my kids were in school. And I figured that would be the medium-term plan. I didn't think I would be in South Bend full-time, but I brought my family out for a summer where I was doing some research and teaching, and they just fell in love with the place.
Wow.
Like this is where we were meant to be. And I thought that they wouldn't be into it. So there was the family part of it where we could really condense our life into the city of South Bend, focused around Notre Dame. And my kids at that time were elementary and high school. So St. Joe Elementary School, St. Joe High School. But they just wanted to be a part of this vibrant campus. And so then I began some conversations with folks, and they made me an offer and brought the family out. So, it's just been amazing to be at a place that's got, kind of the Ivy League UC academics, but there's also, the Virgin on the dome, right? And the grotto and the basilica. And you don't have that on Columbia's campus. So there's no difference in terms of the caliber of scholarship and the students, but there's a real difference in terms of our mission.
That's awesome. And everybody's happy now that you're settled in here?
Everyone's happy. Well, the oldest is here now. He's a sophomore
right.
At the University of Notre Dame. At that point, he was a high school student, and I have a high schooler and elementary school student, and they love it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, now, so you are here as the Coyle Professor in Literacy Education and the inaugural director of the Center for Literacy Education in the Institute for Educational Initiatives, which is part of ACE.
Yep.
You also hold joint appointments in the Departments of English and of Africana Studies. So tell us a bit about your students. Who are they, and what do you teach?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I've been teaching undergraduates, which I love. Then my work at UCLA and Columbia, I taught some undergraduates, but they kind of voiced you on graduate students. So the undergraduates have been really, really great to work with. I have a kind of three lines in terms of the courses. So one really looks at how you apply critical theories to thinking differently about education and working with young people. So that's my Africana Studies class. It's also cross-listed in the Education, Schooling, and Society minor. And so we start, you're looking at, kind of old philosophy, and you end up looking at like youth projects and communities and hip hop, and how to get kids excited about learning. It's interesting because a part of that we'll read Basil Moreau and we'll read Luigi Giussani, and so you get a sense of kind of the theological approach and the critical approach, and at the same time what young people are struggling with today, and how to connect to the issues that matter to them. At the same time, they still have to learn.
Yeah.
So that class is called Critical Pedagogy and Popular Culture. And I get students from all different majors for that. It's an Africana Studies class. In English, my focus has mostly been on the literatures of the African diaspora. So I teach a postcolonial literature and literary theory class where, we begin to think about postcolonial voices. And, I frame it using the postcolonial theory, but I also frame it by looking at the church. Like we have a postcolonial church. And how do we account for the voices that have been muted in the past? And thinking about allowing for this kind of multicultural, multilingual expression. And how do we hold on to the things that we value from what has been called the colonial age, right? So it's not dismissing the modern age of the last 500 years, but it is putting it in a different context.
Yeah.
And, we read some pretty dynamic authors who have a lot of ideas about that. But I tell them it's not about, hating who we are or where we've been. It's just about getting better, right? And, I think that the church does that very well. And, the recent visit, the Pope to Africa, thinking about this is the future of the church. Like, it's not just the future of the church, it's the future of the planet. And if we're going to be a place at Notre Dame where the church does its thinking, we're going to be a place to prepare young people for the world, we have to understand that in order to work profoundly in the world, you have to understand it.
Yeah.
And one of the ways to understand it is through encountering literatures where people have described themselves in their own words, right? So we'll read Chinua Achebe and his experiences in Ghana. We'll read Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Salman Rushdie in India, Jamaica Kincaid in the Caribbean, Toni Morrison. So just a lot of different voices from different perspectives. I teach a class on Toni Morrison as an author who I think is just so profoundly poignant in so many different ways, as an American author, as an African American author, as a woman author, and as a Catholic author. And so we'll look at Toni Morrison's work across each of those, right?
Right.
As her Americanness, her Africanness, her womanness, and her Catholicness. So that's a fun class.
Yeah.
And then I have a couple others, Caribbean Lit, that, down the pipeline, but I can only teach so many classes.
Right.
But the students are great. They come, they want to learn, they want to be challenged. They want to have a sense of their place in the world. They're very thoughtful. The class discussions are really powerful. It's fun working with them as a group. It's working one-on-one, advising theses, and seeing where they take these ideas into the world.
Do you get to work with graduate students as well?
I have not worked so much with graduate students here. Well, I shouldn't say that. I haven't worked with doctoral students. The master's students I have had a chance to work with through the Alliance for Catholic Education.
Yeah.
People who are post the bachelor's degree but are going to be teachers in Catholic schools. And so I do a lot with them around the critical pedagogy, what we call critical Catholic pedagogy. The Alliance for Catholic Education, it's a 2-year program where students will teach in the most high-need Catholic schools around the country. So everywhere from, like Biloxi and Mississippi out to Santa Ana and California to New York and Philadelphia, Chicago. So that's a great program. And about half the students come from Notre Dame, half the students come from other places. And half of them are going to go into like elementary education, half of them are going to go into secondary education. So I do get a chance to work with them pretty intensely.
Awesome. Now, you've been a member of the DeNicola Center's Faculty Advisory Committee pretty much since arriving on campus 2 years ago. How did that happen? How did you get involved with us? And then what has been your involvement with our students, especially like with our Soren Fellows? Yeah,
so the 2 years before coming to Notre Dame full-time when I was a visiting professor, I got a chance to meet a lot of faculty. And so Carter Sneed, your director, found me, and we struck up a relationship. And he said, I'd love for you to be a part of this center. So it was really the personal relationship with Carter. And over the past 2 years, really it's been longer than that. There's been all sorts of wonderful ways, from chairing sessions at the conference to having Soren Fellows in our home for dinner. We also hosted a reading group for Flannery O'Connor with the undergraduates. Last year I was invited to be the Bread of Life keynote speaker, and so I was able to speak with the students around that, and that's led into just some personal interactions with the students. And as we were talking off the air, there was a student who's at the Bread of Life dinner who formed her senior thesis project largely around response to that. So I'm the second advisor on her thesis, so we get to kind of meet and talk about, how some of these ideas that I mentioned in that talk are actually going to inform her senior project.
Wow. Well, let's talk a bit about that, because that was last fall. You spoke, as you say, at our Bread of Life dinner, and your talk was entitled Fighting for Life in the Digital Age, Media Literacy and the New Evangelization. You talked there and you urged students to develop what you called a pro-life media literacy, which doesn't simply ignore the pervasive anti-Catholic, anti-life message that is presented in the popular media by taking a head-in-the-sand approach, as you called it. But instead, you were advocating a combination of healthy skepticism, creativity, and then developing technical skills to make better media. I mean, you said exactly, if we don't like the media we have, develop the skills to create another. So you challenged us, and it was an awesome talk, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But you kind of gave 10 kind of practical takeaways and challenges at the end. But maybe you can kind of unpack that a bit for us, and maybe even issue a challenge or two here if you'd like.
Yeah, first of all, that was a much better summation of the talk than I think the talk itself. So I'm going to have to copy your notes here. No, I think that the challenge, in preparation for our conversation, I thought of 4 distinct categories. And this is the same way that I talk about media literacy with young people and with teachers. So the first one is about how we consume. How can we be smarter consumers of the culture that does exist? Mm-hmm. And the way that I think about it for the pro-life media literacy is, what are the questions that we should be asking of the text? And by text, I mean everything from a film to the internet to apps. What are the questions that we should be asking of those texts as we consume them? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I am inspired to do is we should probably come up with just a list of these, like 10 questions you should ask of every TV show you watch. And one of the things about the media that is pretty clear in the scholarship is that it changes and in some ways co-ops our perspective, even though we don't know that it's happening. Mm-hmm. Right? We get our ideas from all sorts of places, but it's you start walking like your father when you get a certain age. It's not like your dad ever sat you down and said, "Here, walk like me." But you observe it, and all of a sudden, it's like you start walking and talking like your parents. The media is the same way. In nutrition, they say you are what you eat, mm-hmm. and in some ways, in terms of a media engagement, you are what you uncritically consume. So how do we watch shows and play video games and listen to music and engage in a popular culture that we know is pretty overtly anti-Catholic without imbibing some of those values? Right?
Yeah.
So we want to ask specific questions, and in the Bread of Life dinner, I was really talking to young people about kind of attitudes toward sex and sexuality that kind of lead to an anti-life agenda, so to speak. And I don't encourage young people necessarily to turn completely away from that consumption. Right. But I do challenge them to have a critical consumption, ask better questions. That'll lead into some of the other things I think that are important in terms of the challenge. But one thing that we can all do is ask real tough questions of what we consume, and like how is this anti-Catholic agenda playing out? Not just that it is, but in what ways? Like, how is the church referred to? One of the things that I've noticed in a lot of the popular culture that's targeted to young people is there are no consequences for actions. So we've had, just in the past week and a half, like 6 kids that have died from vaping.
Yeah.
No one ever dies from vaping on a TV show, right? It's just fun, right? Right. No one ever turns up pregnant when they have unprotected sex on asking these critical questions, how are these young people able to engage in these activities without having anything bad happen to them? Or when was the last time, you listened to a song that promoted monogamous, healthy relationships between married people, right?
Right.
And they say, well, okay, maybe it's not in there. So, but what is in there? So asking better questions. I do think that there will be some impetus to walk away from some of this culture. Mm-hmm. But then it leads into the second point, and I worry that there's a vacuousness, there's an emptiness in terms of what we replace that with. Right, so you can't take a 19-year-old or even a 39-year-old and take all of their goodies away from them. Here, don't listen to this music, don't watch this, and like, well, what do I listen to or watch? So the second challenge is more about production, right? So what are we producing? And we live in an age now where the technologies have become democratically accessible, right? Yeah. It's just everyone's got democratic access, almost everyone, to technologies of production, whether it's your cell phone or you've got more sophisticated equipment.
Anybody can podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
For example.
Yeah, you can use what's in your back pocket to send a message to millions. Mm-hmm. So we have to be more intentional in the media we produce and the media we sanction. And a lot of that will be in response to the questions that we ask of the media that exist. We need to see more media that show moms and dads who love each other and talk to each other in kind ways and mm-hmm. love their kids and love God, right? That's rare to see, the way that marriage is just constructed as a battle of the sexes in a lot of popular culture, right? And kids are against their parents, and husbands are against wives, and wives are against husbands, and they hate their bosses.
And the dad's always a dummy. And
all
of these sorts of things.
So it's like the dumb dad motif. Mm-hmm. Right? It's like mm-hmm. it's so done, right? Yeah. But it's out there. But we can produce otherwise, to writing our own novels and plays, making our own films, writing our own songs, having our own mobile applications that are just as engaging and exciting for young people and compelling in terms of its entertainment purposes, but they're more educative. Mm-hmm. Or at least all media are educative, but they're educative in terms of our Catholic values. And I feel like that's where we are in the most deficit right now, is cultural producers. And that's where I really challenged, you can frown your nose at the movie, but like, go make one.
Right. And make it compelling.
Yeah.
Because there are lots of, Christian family, faith-friendly films, but they're not always good.
Yeah.
And it's like, if this is the best we have to offer, that's just not compelling either.
No. Yeah. When I was a kid, I was into hip hop, and my dad, there was Christian hip hop. He's like, why don't you listen to this? I was like, Dad, it's bad. It's bad. Yeah. So we do have to get better about that. And that's where I think the young generation, they're hip, and we've got just the ecclesial movements now. I mean, these young people are so fired up, and they're so talented. Just, we need to harness that energy.
Yeah.
Right. And be a filmmaker. We need to support that. So the third area is really how we curate and distribute. And this is where everyone can play a role, whether it's social media or whether it's just getting up in front of your parish and making an announcement. When people do create the media that we are inspired by, how do we share that?
Yeah.
Right? There's a talent to that. I used to just have a 2-part model, and it was consumption and production. Like, no, there is a science to the curation and distribution, whether it's my Twitter feed, you have a Twitter feed, I have a Twitter feed. And, I've got 10,000 followers out there on Twitter. So that's a ministry.
Right.
Right. To say, hey, check this out. Or if the CEC has something going on, like, check this out. That's a distribution. And I feel like we have to be more intentional about that. St. John Paul II talked about evangelizing the culture, right? Which I love. It's just his way of saying, like, get out there, right?
Yeah.
Use the technologies that are available. It means more than that, but it does partly mean co-opting those existing technologies for our own uses and our own purposes. And that's something that is a part of a media literacy. How do I do this? How do I engage on social media? How can I do that just offline, right? With my colleagues and my coworkers and those who live in the residence hall with me.
Telling everybody, I saw this great film.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. Getting that film, getting a showing at your parish.
Yeah.
Or on campus. Bringing that film, maybe even bringing the filmmaker. This is a part of that literacy, the distribution. So we've got, a few $100s in our residence hall fund. Let's bring this filmmaker. And let's show this film. Let's show it in DPAC, right? And charge $1 admission and get a few hundred people in there. So that's something I think we can all do more of. And the fourth one is just advocacy. What does it mean for us to be advocates? And that term sometimes has negative connotations. Activism can have negative connotations, but advocacy, we have to be advocates for those that are doing it right. And that we can all do. It's kind of related to the distribution, but it's different. How do we advocate for those who have who have done the work, right? So it's not like you just have to do it. You just they need support.
Right.
So when Soren Fellow graduates and decides that she's going to be poor and write the Catholic novel of the 21st century, then she's going to need advocates, right? She's going to need those of us that are willing to go that extra mile. But those are the four, right? Asking better questions, what we consume, actually developing, as you say, some of the technical skills to be producers, being distributors and curators, and then fourth, being advocates.
Awesome. Well, I can do those things. So great. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a challenge.
So
right?
That's a challenge. Exactly.
You use your cell phone for good.
Well, what are you working on now?
So, for medical reasons, I have had to step back a little bit from the university, daily grind, but it's allowed me to jump back into some manuscripts that I really care about. So one really focuses on popular culture. And it's a book that I wrote in 2004. And I have reclaimed the copyright, and I had shopped around ideas for revision with several publishers. And I ultimately decided what I wanted to do was publish it through my Center for Literacy Education and give it out for free.
Oh, wow.
So that book's going to have a January 2020, and it's mostly targeted to educators. And so my goal is to get it to 100,000 educators, and I have kind of people pre-ordering, at least giving me their email address or where to send it. I'm about halfway there, about 50,000 educators so far.
Wow.
Just in the first couple of weeks. So going back to that manuscript and looking at, your 32-year-old writer self when you're 48, it can be very humbling. It's like, boy, I knew everything when I was 32 years old.
You're 50% older right now than you were then.
It is scary. It is very scary that person who wrote the book, I think technically is closer to my oldest son's age than my age now.
Wow.
But that's a lot of fun because I know it's going to be read. It was, the first version was read. And to think about these ideas 15 years later, the funny thing, Ken, is I expect it to be changing a lot, but I find myself agreeing with myself, maybe tempering my arguments a little bit, maybe
Sure.
like stepping off of the hobby horse. But for the most part, it's like I still agree with this stuff. I guess the products have changed, but the concepts haven't changed as much. But it'll be great to kind of shore that book up and to get it out there. Then I have a series of projects on the teaching of literature. One of the things I think that, we share a lot of affinities between, my work over in IEI and the DeNicola Center, but this idea that powerful literature has a place in the education of our young. Mm-hmm. There are two questions that are, kind of embedded in that. One is, what is powerful literature? What does it mean to teach it? Mm-hmm. And so that's always been an area where I've been focused. That I think that authors have done half the work in giving us these really incredible texts, but how we teach them says a lot about our values. It will say a lot about how our young people see the world. Mm-hmm. So these projects, some of them are focused on specific literatures, like how one would teach, the literature of the African Diaspora, how one would teach literature that connects to Catholic social values or literature of a particular time or place. Asking those questions and then working with teachers. And this, I have the fortune to be able to work with teachers across a wide range of age groups that they teach. So from elementary to secondary and tertiary education. So these projects would be, engaging first grade teachers, but also college teachers.
Yeah.
And how do we make these texts come alive for young people? Understanding what's at stake. I mean, I think that a great author helps to illuminate the human condition. In ways that other kinds of texts and genres don't do, like reading a novel or a play or poem, are very different than some of the other technical genres. In some ways, I think a novel, tells history in a different way.
Yeah.
And historiography is a very important discipline, but it's just different.
Sure.
So I'm super excited about being able to work on the ground with teachers. Part of my role in Center for Literacy Education, we're now home of the National Council of Teachers of English Squire Office for research. So we're hosting that office and basically kind of responsible for the research trajectory of the entire professional organization. So
wow.
250,000 teachers.
Yeah, no pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. But we get to set the agenda,
wow.
and help them think differently about the teaching of literature. And I believe that the teaching of literature has always been connected to value propositions. And I think that's important. You can't eliminate the value proposition from the educational enterprise. Yeah. But we do have to ask the question of what now do we value? Mm-hmm. So that's the second set of projects. And the third are the academic word I call discourse studies. And that's really just kind of cultural studies, looking at the media and through asking specific questions about like how are we forming a set of ideas or values about a particular theme or idea. So the two that I've really been focused on is the African diaspora. Our attitudes toward a group of people and a place are largely determined by the media that we consume. So that's everything from film and television to music to news media to political documents. The second major area of study is really Catholicism in the media. And there are a few others on campus at McGrath and elsewhere that are really interested in this question. But how is the church and how is the faith constructed and deconstructed in media discourse? My goal is to use this year of recovery to really jump into that research, but to write some proposals, because I think that we have to call out the anti-Catholicism in the work of the media, and I consider myself, kind of pro-Catholic and anti-racist. And so these two studies allow me to deal with each of these areas, right? Because we just have to hold the media to account,
right?
That you can't continue to just uncritically distribute, whether it's, around race or around religion, these very negative messages without people who are impacted by that speaking out. And I want to do it in an academic way. Edward Said, who was a colleague, he was at Columbia before I got there, but he did that for the Islamic world and said that, the anti-Islamic sentiment in the media is unconscionable. But he did it in an academic way. He just kind of laid out the text, and these are all the ways that this is an unacceptable discourse. And I was really inspired by that, and I thought this is, first of all, this is something we should be doing for the African diaspora, for these kids, whether you're in Haiti or Trinidad or Gary, Indiana, or South Bend, and you're just watching TV and no one's around. What are you learning about yourself? Or you're kind of reading these messages through your cell phone. Like they're teaching you things. Mm-hmm. They're teaching you that you're ugly or unintelligent. Well, I think it's the same way for Catholicism. My kids attend Catholic schools, but if you're, a devout Catholic in a public school, and what are you learning about your faith implicitly through the discourse? So I'm really excited about that work. I have some working hypotheses, as you can imagine, about what I will find, but I'm more excited about helping us just to be able to walk away from these discourses and to have a language to deconstruct them. And you have to call anti-Catholicism what it is. Mm-hmm. That it's acceptable. It's acceptable to say things about Catholics and the church that you could not say about other religions.
Right.
When did that become okay? Right. So you can, if we look at a media story, right, and we look at a transcript. So that's the kind of want to get down to that granular level. Say it has become acceptable. Mm-hmm. And 90%, and that's being generous. 90% of the stories that cover the church are negative.
It's being very generous.
Yeah. They just talk about, a particular crisis. They don't talk about the good that the church does. Yeah. So I want to use my academic platform to kind of speak back against that.
Well, this is clearly related to what you were saying earlier, too. Sure. That first thing that we need to do is to ask, what is this saying? What is the media saying? Yeah. And if it's implicit in everything that in more than 90% of the stories, if that anti-Catholicism is implicit, that's going to change the way I view my own faith, is essentially what you're saying, too.
Exactly.
It's kind of that Schrodinger's cat kind of thing.
Yeah.
By reading the story, I'm less compelled by my own faith, and by being less compelled by my own faith, I'm becoming an anti-Catholic in a way too.
Exactly,
which is a self-hatred.
Yeah, well, that's where the work really starts for me. In this kind of an ontology of self-loathing. And so, in the two studies I talked about, you can there's a relationship between media consumption and self-loathing.
Yeah.
So you're ashamed.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a lot of folks that feel as though they should be ashamed of their faith because of this larger media discourse.
Sure.
So my work is kind of challenging myself to do what I mentioned,
like you say,
to ask different questions and to produce. It's a different kind of production. It's not like I'm making films or documentaries, although there might be an interesting documentary. To work with some filmmakers on this. But the first phase is really to gather the artifacts into what I call an archive. So to create an archive of kind of media artifacts and to begin to systematically ask these questions.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like you've got quite a project, Eddie.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming to be with us, and what a delightful conversation.
Thank you, Ken. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you to Professor Ernest Morrell. Find a link to his excellent Bread of Life talk, as well as contact information to receive a copy of his forthcoming book in the show notes. Subscribe to Ethics and Culture Cast so that you can always get the latest episodes by visiting ethicscenter.nd.edu/podcast. We would love your feedback. Please review the show on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts, and email your suggestions to cecpodcast@nd.edu. Our theme music is I Dunno by Grapes, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution License. We'll see you next time on Ethics and Culture Cast. Until then, make good decisions.